Yeah, this should take about 20 minutes, but it depends how much I start waffling on each slide. So yeah, I'm gonna, if you've been on the previous talks, you would have met Jazz, and she's shortly going to be going on maternity leave. So I'm going to be covering her role while she's off on maternity, and she's actually on a course today. So I started this on Monday, so she's asked me to do this talk today. But before that, I've been working for the Wildlife Trust for the last 6 years on the Devon Greater Horseshoe Bat project. So I've got some sort of linking the bat knowledge with some of the gardening stuff. So hopefully you'll find it interesting. And because it's the Greater Horseshoe Bat that we've been looking after on our project. So there's a few little images there of Greater Horseshoe Bat. So this isn't a Greater Horseshoe Bat and it's not a bat in the UK, but I just thought, because I like these pictures, I'll just show you a picture of the biggest bat in the whole world, because there are about 1,300 different species of bats in the world, and they're mammals, and we have about 5,000 mammal species in the world, so about a quarter of those are bat species, so pretty successful in that way. And this flying fox has a wingspan, so if it's stretched out, its wings tip to tip is nearly 2 meters in size, so it's pretty enormous. And then the opposite end of the scale is the smallest bat in the world, and that's a little bat called Kitty's Hognose Bat. And sometimes it's called the Bumblebee Bat, and you can see how tiny it is, why it might be called the Bumblebee Bat, because it's not much bigger than that person's thumb. Also not found in the UK. And why, what's the point of bats? Why do they matter so much? Well, they're just a really critical part of the sort of global ecosystem and biodiversity. And I think we all know now, don't we, that the more species that we have, the better for nature. And bats worldwide, they are great pest controllers. So they're like a free way of controlling pests. And somebody's worked out that in the United States that pest control from bats is worth about $22 billion a year to the sort of agricultural industry. And a pipistrelle bat, which is one of our most common bats in the UK, can eat over 3,000 insects in one night. So they do a lot of hoovering up of insects. And in the tropics, bats are important pollinators as well. So they pollinate things like cocoa. So that's pretty important for us and all our chocolate that we like to eat, and things like mangoes and banana trees. But closer to home, here, is that bar coming up? Can you see it? It's on there. Can you see the top bar? No, good. So these are just some of our UK bat species. We have about 18 species of bats in the UK. They all eat insects. But they're, the most common bat that you're likely to see is a pipistrelle bat, which is quite a small bat, and it tends to flit around if you have a garden, or if you can see out of from your window as it gets dark, they tend to come out just before sunset, and you see them sort of zooming around really fast. And that's a pipistrelle bat. They're our most common bats in the UK. But bat numbers, unfortunately, despite being such a successful sort of species with the different species of bats, their numbers have declined dramatically. So the Greater Horseshoe Bat, which is the project I've just been working on, there's a picture of it there, that's declined by over 90%. So numbers have plummeted by 90% in the last sort of 50, 60, 70 years. And that's just because really a loss of the habitats that bats need to find the insects. So if it doesn't take much to work out, if you've got less insects, then you're going to have less bats and other wildlife. And that's because of things like housing development. So obviously over the last 100 years, there's been a lot of building of housing, there's been industrial development, and also the farming has become much more sort of intensive. So a lot of hedges have been taken away to make a big field like the one in this picture. I mean, here in Devon, we're pretty lucky, aren't we? We've got a pretty good landscape with hedges, lots of hedges, but even here we've lost a lot of our hedges. There's a lot of fields which would have once been smaller, divided up by hedges. So all these sort of places where you find insects, there are less and less of them around now, and that's why bat numbers are going down. So the more we can do to help them, the better, really. And what do they need? Well, they need somewhere to live. So bats might take up residence in old buildings. In the summer, particularly, they would roost in a building rather than a colder place, which, like a cave, which they would use at the moment. They'd be hibernating in sort of places like caves or man-made quarries and mines. Trees are really important for bats. So the little pipistrelle bats, they can be found roosting just behind some bark or a bit of flaky bark or some ivy on a tree. So any little thing like that is important. So a tree that's taken down, you know, if it's not checked for bats, it may well be a roost for bats that they use throughout the year. And then, as well as needing something to live just like us, because we're mammals as well, we need somewhere to live, don't we? Some shelter, and we need food. And so, as I said, bats in the UK all like insects. So they need habitats, just like the ones in these pictures. So woodlands, meadows for insects, and hedges. And they use hedges to get around the countryside as well, to find their way around in the dark. So they're a source for getting around, and they're a good place to find insects to eat. And then gardens, again, is an important place for bats, because as we've lost a lot of habitats, the number of, if you add up all of the gardens and open spaces, you know, in towns and villages across the UK, you end up with quite a large area of land. And so if everybody made their garden more friendly for wildlife, that's going to have a really big knock-on effect. It might not seem much to one person, but if everyone does it or does something, then that's going to be really good. I just thought I'd show you this close-up picture of a greater horseshoe bat, because most people have never seen anything like that before. And that whole bit on the front there is its nose. It's called a nose leaf. You can see its little mouth and little chin at the bottom there, and the quite big ears. And bats get around by echolocating. So they send out sound waves which bounce off things around them, and the sound waves bounce back, and they can tell from the frequency and the speed of the sound coming back where they are in the countryside. Are they about to crash into a tree? Or can they detect a moth that they want to catch? And they can use that just in the pitch black to find their way around. And it's called a greater horseshoe bat because of, you can see that horseshoe shape on the bottom part of the nose leaf, as we call it. And this is just a picture of a greater horseshoe bat in flight, catching a moth. So if you look in it on the left-hand side there, it's just scooping up a moth into its wing, and it will then take that up to its mouth. And you can see it's got these tiny little sharp teeth. And a greater horseshoe bat will then go and hang upside down on a tree somewhere while it's polishing off its meal. And then it drops all the wing bits and then the casings and the hard bits of a beetle onto the floor below it. So sometimes in their roosts you can find little piles of wings and things, and you know that a great horseshoe bat has been there. Whereas a smaller bat, so a great horseshoe bat is quite a big bat. It's about kind of 40, up to sort of 30-40 centimeter wingspan. Whereas the little pipistrelle bat's about 16 sort of centimeters when they're flying, and they just hoover up little midges and mosquitoes as they're flying around. They don't need to stop because they've got to eat like 2,000 or 3,000 a night, so they're just like hoovering them all up and flying around. Whereas the greater horseshoe bats eat bigger things like moths and beetles, and they have to wait for a bit to digest one when they've eaten it and moving on to the next one. So they're a hunter, they're a predator, bats, so they're eating insects just like the ones in these images here. But they're also hunted by predators themselves. So they're something like a sparrowhawk in this picture here, a barn owl might find a bat a good meal. Unfortunately, the worst predator of bats in our country is pet cats. So if you've got a cat with a fondness for bats, it's quite good to keep them at dusk when all the bats are starting to emerge from their roosts, because they tend to lie in wait. They know where they're coming out of a roost, and then they slash at them with their claws, and they can injure or even kill bats. So or if they've got a bell on, that can help. And this is just in terms of doing bat-friendly gardening, and one of the things we've done on the project over the last 5 years, which has just finished, is encourage communities to sort of get involved with bat-friendly gardening. Or when I say bat-friendly gardening, I mean gardening that's going to encourage insects, which will have a knock-on effect, good effect for bats. And in Chudley, here near Exeter, the community created a bat-friendly, insect-friendly garden with lots of plants that would attract insects. And the idea of that is there's a sign telling people what's planted there. So when they visit, people visit and they might take those ideas back and do it in their own garden. So that's what we've been trying to encourage. When people say, what can I do to help bats or wildlife? Because it's such a big issue, isn't it? The whole climate emergency and loss of wildlife. Like, what can I do to help? Well, you can do really simple things in your own garden or on your balcony or whatever you've got, whatever space you have to help. And also, you know, anything you do to help bats, what we've always said in our project, is going to help other things. So it'll help insect numbers and other animals such as hedgehogs. And I think Jazz talked to you about hedgehogs and how you can help them. So the thing about gardening, and this may be some of the stuff that Jazz has already told you if you've listened to her other talks, but it's worth saying it again, is the more different types of plants you have, the greater range of insects you'll appeal to. And the big red cross at the bottom of that slide is on some sort of bedding, the traditional bedding plants like sort of petunias and some geraniums and things that you can get in garden centres. They look nice for us, but they're not very good for insects because they don't have the sort of pollen and nectar that some of our more native plants that we find naturally in the UK. So anything that's kind of used to always grow in the UK is going to be a pretty good bet. And I'll show you the logo later on, but the Royal Horticultural Society has a logo with a bee called, is like perfect for pollinators. And if you're in a garden centre and you see a plant with that on, you know it's going to be a good one for wildlife. So mowing grass is a big sort of thing that if you want to have a big mown piece of grass in your garden, that's great, but it's not going to be very good for wildlife. So if you can bring in bits of wildflowers or rough bits where the grass is just left to grow, so like in the top middle picture here, there's some lovely wildflowers in the middle there and rough grass at the back, but you can still have some paths or some areas to sit out or whatever you need your garden for. But the more, you know, the messier your garden, this is good for people who don't like to spend too much time gardening, the better it's going to be for wildlife, without a doubt. And if you can try not to put any kind of chemicals or gardening pesticides and things onto at all, then you will get more and more wildlife, and the things that you consider a pest will get eaten by other things, and you get this nice sort of little closed system where everything's working together, even in a small space. You can probably seen maybe bug hotels before. These are quite elaborate ones here on the right, but even a pile of twigs in the corner of a garden is basically a place for insects to live. So when we say bug hotel, it doesn't have to be a hotel. It could just be a little shepherd's hut in the corner of the garden, or a little pile of twigs for animals. And that won't just be good for insects. You know, hedgehogs might be hibernating under there, and other creatures will find shelter there. Like we get a few slow worms in our garden. We find them in our compost bin. That you can see that on the top left there, the slow worm. They're lovely when you see them in the garden. And then if you're handy with a saw, you might want to make a bug bench. I think these are great, aren't they? You've got somewhere to sit, and then underneath you've got some great sort of space for wildlife. And on the bottom right there, if you drill holes into wood like that, that's really good place for bees to live in. And you know, bee numbers have really gone down, so anything that we can do to help bees as well is a good thing. A pond is one of the best things you can have in your garden, and it could just be, obviously we don't all have space to have a massive pond like that one in the main picture, but the tiny pond on the right, you know, like we've got a couple of old ceramic troughs that we got from a tip or something, and we sunk them into the ground, and really quickly there were like newts in there, and the dragonfly comes and sort of lays their eggs around the edge, and you see them flying past later in the summer. So you don't need much water, and it's obviously essential for animals to have a drink, you know, to get some water, especially if it's drier or the water's frozen. Other water, hopefully the pond they can have a drink from. And even I like these pictures to show what you can do in a small space, so you can go upward with your planting. So there's a sort of a trellis sort of thing on the left there, and with planting pots and things all up it. And similarly on the right there, and if you want something you can eat, then why not have sort of some strawberries or tomato plants and something like that. They'll all be good for wildlife. And then again, you can do more. If you want to put, there's a bat box there on the left, some bird boxes. There's lots of sort of fun ways to try and get wildlife in your garden, but you don't have to construct all these things. If there's food in your garden in the form of insects, perhaps a bird seed, there's a homemade bird feeder there on the right hand side, then you know it's going to be good for the wildlife. We're going to send out some links and things after today, so don't worry about any of these websites and places, but we'll send you all the links. So if you're interested in looking up anything, you can. There's lots of information. In fact, there's so much information online, it's almost overwhelming, like where do I look for stuff? But on our bat project, we created a booklet which is available as on our website to look at, which says some ideas for things you can plant that are good for nighttime pollinators. So the moths are coming out at night, and the more moths there are, the more sort of pollination there is, and the more food for bats. And then the various sort of plants, just sort of natural plants that you would have found in meadows long ago, sort of poppies and daisies and things like that, that they all look lovely and they're really good for wildlife. And there's that bee logo that I was mentioning about, the perfect for pollinators. If you see that on a plant, you know it's going to be a good one. The top right there, the Action for Insects, is a Wildlife Trust's campaign that you may have heard of, but again, we'll send a link to that, and it's a way of getting involved in taking action for insects. Numbers have really declined a lot, so we want to just get more insects because they're an important thing at the bottom of the food chain, aren't they? If we don't have the insects, we don't have the things that eat them and the things at the top and so on. So it has a really big knock-on effect. So yes, we'll send some links to some of those. And that's it. And just in case anyone asks, I'll preempt it by, if you find an injured bat, then there's a Bat Conservation Trust helpline, and that's their website, which we'll send out. And there are people, bat carers around the country, who will come and collect and look after and injured bats and try and release them back into the wild if they can. Thank you.